another way that you can be misleading is when axis breaks that you applied to your charts are not indicated. Here we see two horizontal bar charts, which, as you learned, should not be used in the first place. And while the lower one has a scale from 0 to 20, the upper one, upon closer inspection, we can see that its scale goes from 0 to 9, but there is a curious interruption because it basically starts from 6 instead of 0. This break in the y-axis has been indicated, but quite insufficiently so. You can see that there is a very thin white line going across all the bars. If you minimize this figure a little bit, it becomes almost invisible. And when I first saw this chart, it rather looked like a glitch in the data or a problem when saving the file and of compression, for example. So if you cut out your data in this manner, you have to make the white gap across all the bars much more visible, that it's visible at first glance. In fact, axis breaks, I would argue, are almost never necessary in the first place. Here we see a chart which displays a percentage, and we can see that all data points, which in this case were nicely individually displayed, are around 95%, something like this. We can see along the y-axis that there's a very curious break. It starts from 0 and goes all the way to 80, and then picks up at 80 again and goes all the way to the 100. So in fact, there isn't even a real break in the data, but what's happening is that they have a different scale. So the axis, the length of 10 is variable in the upper and the lower part. So I did a quick redo for you. You can show obviously exactly the same data with a continuous scale that you don't have to introduce an axis break to. And I would like to stress that you should always reconsider whether each figure is really necessary, when in this case all that you want to communicate is a co-localization of 99%. The next argument I want to get across is that axis breaks really are not intuitive at all. What you can see here is a published figure which at first glance looks roughly fine. So I'm gonna move my image briefly because I'm realizing it's in the way. So at the very first glance you can see that in the figure below most bars seem to have roughly the same height. The pink one is high in the first two charts and low in the last one, and the yellow one is similar in the first and the third chart. But upon closer inspection, you realize that there is an axis break, in fact, in the first chart. It starts from 0 and goes to 2. Then there is a very clear and nicely done axis break, and the chart picks up again at 10 and goes all the way to 40. So the reason that the axis break was introduced is, in fact, that the scales of these charts are hugely variable. The first one, they need to have data that goes from 0 to 40. In the second one, they have data that goes from 0 to 5. And in the third chart, they show data from 0 to 2 units only. So variable scales are in itself already not very easy for your audience to read. And what I do then usually is to make a quick mental or an actual sketch, a redo of the figure. And wow! What you can see is that the real values are hugely different, and each time that you introduce an axis break, even like in this case it might be necessary because the data is so variable, you lose some aspect of the, you lose some of the message. In this part, I would argue, it's completely lost on the audience, the amount of variability from the first to the third chart. I would not have guessed, even with reading the numbers itself. And sometimes you find axis breaks that are not breaks at all in the data, but in fact, upon closer inspection, turn out to be something different. In this case, a box plot. So when I first saw this figure, I thought, oh, there's an axis break, and I was going to complain that it's not indicated in the y-axis. And then I realized that this is not at all a break in the data, but that in this case, the median, which is usually shown with a fat black line going across the box of the box plot, is in this case, for some curious reason, shown in white, which signals to an audience something like an axis break usually. So don't do that. The next way how you mislead with charts is when missing data that can happen in experiments is not indicated as such. So if you lack data in your experiments or in your observations, you can never be sure that a trend actually is continued. So for some data, it's reasonable to assume that a continuous rate. For example, if we observe the growth of a plant or of a human or something that continuously increases and cannot sporadically grow. In this case, it's reasonable to assume that the data continues to grow and we just were not able to measure in the missing time points. For some other data that is highly variable, however, we cannot assume a continuous rate. So for example, a market value of companies is extremely flexible. The Dow Jones indices go up and down all the time, and unfortunately in an unpredictable manner often. So if you have missing data, you cannot draw a continuous line indicating that you had continuous data. So in this case, in this chart from Alberto Cairo, what you can see is that there's a continuous line of monthly sales that increases from January to probably something like August. It has a dramatic downwards turn late fall and rises up in December again, probably coinciding with Christmas shopping or something like this. Upon closer inspection, you should, however, realize quickly that in this case, the axis layout of the x-axis is not continuous. So January to June is in fact 6 months, not just 4. So the problem in this case is that if you have missing months or missing data, then you should find a way of indicating that to your audience. One possibility is that you simply interrupt the line and you leave out the data. To me, this is a best case scenario, especially if you're not sure how the trend actually was continued, if it could have fluctuated, for example. The alternative, if you assume a continuous growth, is that you make a little bit dashed line that connects the data before with the data after. As in this case, you are assuming and you're implying to your audience that there is a continuous growth. If the data indicates that, you can do a dashed line. If it's highly variable data, please simply leave out the data entirely. The next way how you mislead, another possibility for you to mislead is when you confuse area with radius. So when we discussed already the possibility that you can encode quantities either by length or by area or by saturation of a color. In the case that you choose area, you must be sure that what you're actually putting down in a figure is the area and not scaled to the radius. So here we see a control way. So x is 4 times as little as y. And if you scale that by area, it is proportional. However, if you take if you increase the radius from 1 to 4, you end up having an area that is much, much bigger than what it should be for the data you're encoding. So always calculate the area, which is a little bit more laborious than simply increasing the radius of your bubble size. And that obviously applies not only to bubbles, but also to any shape that you use to encode quantitative data. That could be a rectangle in something called a tree map. Look that up if you've never seen one. It could be the size in a Voronoi graph. Look it up if you have never heard of this before. Or it could also be the area in any kind of shape that you are requiring for your chart. Sometimes there are triangles like this. So in this case, a tech report wanted to explain the pay level of different employees. Some employees are paid too much. I'd love to be in that category. Some are paid enough, and some are women. I have no idea what this graph really wants to say. But what I do know is that the area that is used to encode these quantities is not actually proportional to the real value. So the red triangle, 35%, is a lot less smaller than it should be compared to the 55% of the women's incomes. You are also misleading very often in charts when you increase three-dimensional spaces. So I would argue that I have not seen a single example where a 3D effect ever helped. The third dimension always ends up redistributing the data and changing the area. And we've just learned before that the area is a fantastic way of encoding quantities if it's done properly. So what you can see here is this textbook example of a misleading pie chart in 3D. Make a quick guess of the percentages occupied by A, B, C, and D. And since I'm already giving away that it's a misleading pie chart, you'll probably be a bit more careful by inspecting it and really try to figure out just how much bigger C is than A. If you plot the same chart as a two-dimensional pie chart, a regular pie chart, you can see the real proportions, which is that B and D are roughly the same. That's not really surprising and sort of looked like this almost, because in your mind you can flip back a little bit of the 3D effect. However, item A and C are hugely different, and in fact they're not the same size, and C isn't bigger at all, but it's less than half the size of A. So each time you introduce this three-dimensional effect, you change the perceived area, which really makes it inaccessible to your audience to see the real values out of an area. So please do not do that. Another way how 3D effects are often incorporated for absolutely zero good reason is that bars are not represented as 2D bars but as 3D bars. In this case, these are really simple numbers, 0, 5, 11 and 31, and there's no reason to introduce a three-dimensional effect. So the three-dimensional effect problem is this. In order to see the height, we go across from the bar all the way until we hit the y-axis in order to read off the value. If we have a three-dimensional effect, we have to really force our eyes to not look roughly where the bar ends, but instead find the corner more in the foreground, which would be this. So what we actually have to do is go to the front corner here and then go across and then kind of stop a little bit before we hit the y-axis, because we are already set towards the z a little bit. So this is really tricky, and it's not intuitive, and it's not simple, and most importantly, you don't gain anything by showing such a graph in a three-dimensional plot. The last way that we want to discuss today is how you mislead is when you leave out data or you don't show data. So here is an example that you already are familiar with. We have a bar chart which encodes a number of data points, and in the bar chart we cannot see the actual distribution of the data, and only by plotting them as the real data points we can appreciate that maybe in this case there are actually two response groups in condition A, which might be men and female, or children versus adults. It might be two types of population groups that respond differently in a traffic situation, or God knows what you are dealing with in your scientific world. However, always plot the data and always show your audience as much of the real data as possible. So I would like to encourage you to become a data detective, and each time that you interact with charts and graphs and visualizations, to really first of all carefully check the x and the y-axis labels and the layout. You should always make sure that bar charts really start at 0, and if not, be extremely careful with who is trying to say what. Always also double check the baseline of a line chart. Why does a line chart not start at 0? Does it make sense? Should it start at 0? Would it change anything at all? You should always make sure that the data is complete, and that make sure that there are no breaks in the data that you maybe need to know about. And as always, you should make sure that the data type, chart type used is actually suitable for the data. And do not only check other people's work, but obviously become a data detective for your own work.